IISS-US. My name is Randy Bell. I'm the managing director here. We're very happy to have David Ucko and Robert Egnell here to discuss their new book, Counterinsurgency in Crisis. And just so you know, this is for sale up at the front desk. And normally it's $50, but today only it's $30, so I recommend that you buy it all. This book was workshopped at the IISS in London in December of 2010 and had significant input from some of our researchers over in London. David was a researcher at the IISS-US in 2008, is that right? And also was in London in 2001, so has a long history with the organization. We're going to they're going to give a brief presentation, 5 to 10 minutes each, and then we have Tom Mahnken, both from SAIS and the War College, who's going to respond to the book. Let me give you just a quick bio of everybody. So David is an associate professor at the College of International Security Affairs at the National Defense University. He teaches courses on counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, and researches war to peace transition, civil wars, and military innovation. In addition to the new book, he's also co-editor of Reintegrating Armed Groups After Conflict, and previously the only thing he did important was be at the ISS. Robert Egnell is a visiting professor and director of teaching with the Security Studies program, as well as senior faculty advisor for the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. Currently on leave from a position as associate professor at the Swedish National Defense College. Also a founder of the Stockholm Center for Strategic Studies, a think tank created in 2005 in response to a growing demand for accurate, objective, and non-governmental research and policy advice in the Swedish and international contexts. And finally, we have Tom Mahnken, senior research professor of strategic studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS. He's also currently the Jerome E. Levy Chair of Economic Geography and National Security at the U.S. Naval War College and editor of the Journal of Strategic Studies. He previously served as the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy Planning, as he was staff director of the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review, Independent Panels, Force Structure, and Personal Subpanel, and he was on the staff of the Commission on the Intelligence Capabilities of the U.S. regarding weapons of mass destruction. He is a National Security Fellow at the John M. Olin Institute for Strategic Studies at Harvard University and has his PhD from SAIS. I'll turn it over to David to get started. We have about 30 minutes here, and then we'll do Q&A for the rest of the hour.
Well, I'll actually turn it over to Robert because he has the sort of first bit, but you'll hear from me later. So,
right. So one of the original research questions of this project was, since counterinsurgency came back in force over the last decade, the British themselves sort of said, "This is like coming home. This is what we're good at, this is what the regimental system is built for," and they were very self-confident in advising the United States as well on how to do counterinsurgency. So our original question was, well, if the British are so good, then whatever happened in Basra and Helmand? But rather than focus this talk on the specific challenges of the British, we thought it would be more interesting for a US audience to talk more broadly about counterinsurgency and to engage with the future of counterinsurgency debate that is raging in DC right now, of course. And to start off with, I will sort of highlight the challenges of counterinsurgency in the contemporary context, and then I'll turn it over to David and try and salvage whatever damage I've done already. First of all, it seems to be slightly remarkable that counterinsurgency, which was of course a colonial policing approach, was revived in the era of liberal interventions or humanitarian interventions. First of all, the historical score sheet isn't that great. So it's not like we have revived an approach that always worked really well in the past. Actually, there's very few pure victories in the past, which means whatever we do when we apply to the contemporary context, we at least need to carefully look at these specific cases. Secondly, when we look at the past campaigns, as a lot of talented historians have done in the last few years, we can also note that our historical understanding of past counterinsurgency campaigns are really problematic, that they are based on sort of cherry picking, and that our 21st century understanding of COIN is quite tainted by the sort of the liberal intervention glasses that we use today. So we have come to overemphasize the hearts and minds aspects, the handing out blankets, building roads, digging wells aspects of operations, while downplaying the often equally, if not more important, coercive aspects of operations, the massive use of force, executions, and forced population movement that were very common aspects of even the most revered of all campaigns in Malaya. So we have a problematic concept of counterinsurgency when we look at it historically, as well as our own understanding of it. A third challenge is that the context has obviously changed since the heyday of counterinsurgency operations in Malaya and elsewhere. One important aspect is that aims have changed, that colonial policing or withdrawal or orderly withdrawal from the colonies is a very different thing from the sort of the liberal state-building campaigns in which we have applied counterinsurgency in the contemporary era. A second important difference is that the past campaigns were internal campaigns, where they were of course not the sort of the mainland operations, but they were internal in terms of the empires. While today we are talking about expeditionary operations, which is in support of quite often rather problematic host governments, which means that a really different thing. And then we have the resources applicable to counterinsurgents. So the internal nature of past campaigns meant that the British or the French could draw upon the vast resources of the colonial administrators and the vast experience that they had in terms of the local culture, the allies they had in terms of local forces, police units, etc. And finally, the nature of the insurgents have also to some extent changed. Now that is an ongoing debate, and I don't have time to go into too much, but the fact that they have support from global networks, that they have information technology at their disposal for their hearts and minds approaches means that counterinsurgency has to adapt to the changing nature of insurgency. There are some even more problematic aspects when we apply counterinsurgency in the contemporary era. And of course, every theory or concept that we use is supposed to help us make sense of a rather complex reality. And it's supposed to help us really understand the problem at hand and how best to approach it. If the concept doesn't help in that, then we have a real problem. So to what extent does counterinsurgency help us understand the nature of contemporary operations and the problems at hand? Well, first of all, I'd like to say that it's a hell of a lot better concept than conventional warfare was in 2003. It helped the US armed forces go through a steel bath of adaptation to the contemporary context that has been very useful. But apart from that, there's also some real challenges. First of all, is the problem in Iraq and Afghanistan really an insurgency? And the way we can approach that is, if we remove what we think of as the insurgency in Afghanistan, if we win, will that solve the problem of Afghanistan? Will that in the end create stability or achieve whatever objectives we have? And that is, of course, something we can debate. A second problem in terms of our understanding is the assumption of legitimacy in counterinsurgency. The thinking that we are, as sort of the support of the central power, almost by nature, the benign power, and that we will attract support from the local population. And thirdly, and I would say most importantly, counterinsurgency is by definition conservative. It is about maintaining the existing order It is not about instigating vast societal change, although some adaptation might be necessary in order to deal with some of the grievances that fuels the insurgency. But otherwise, it is conservative about maintaining the existing order. And when we look at what we have been doing in Iraq and Afghanistan, it is very hard for me to see Western input in those campaigns as something conservative, that it supports the existing order rather than perhaps even being sort of the revolutionary agent of change. So rather than thinking about, and this is slightly provocative of course, but rather than think of us as counterinsurgents, we should perhaps think of ourselves as insurgents, the revolutionary agents of change, and we should study Mao, Che Guevara and others in order to see how we can achieve large-scale societal change with the support of the local population with rather limited means that we're willing to commit. So with that rather negative note on counterinsurgency as applied in the contemporary context, what can we salvage from this? And that's where I'll just stop and hand over to David to try and salvage this.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to return to IISS, where, as Randy mentioned, I began my career in 2001, and I've worked on and off with IISS in various capacities really since then. So to be here now and speak at this office is a real pleasure to me. Now, just to follow up from where Robert left off, we're really at a critical moment, whether you look at Britain or the United States or many of the main military powers of NATO, where we want the rights that go along with global leadership, but we don't necessarily want the responsibility and costs that go along with it. So we need to find new ways of managing world order. Now, today, that discussion is unfortunately marred by a handful of slogans and mantras that do not get us very far. No more Iraqs, no more Afghanistans, an indirect approach only, so on and so forth. I don't find that any of those arguments are very helpful. I mean, of course, no one in their right mind would want to do another counterinsurgency on the scale of Iraq or Afghanistan. But we also have to remember, of course, that neither Iraq nor Afghanistan started out as counterinsurgencies. We sort of evolved towards that end point. So we have to be very careful before we think that we can once again go into the world and craft a campaign to our liking that will basically evolve according to our plan. Secondly, whereas the ways in which counterinsurgency was implemented in Afghanistan and Iraq leave much to be desired, I think it would also be foolish to forget everything that we've learned, both positive and negative lessons from the last 10 to 15 years, particularly given the military orthodoxy of treating war as a primarily apolitical, militarily decisive phenomenon, completely divorced from the people over which control is ultimately contested. So I think the future lies not in a simplistic notion of either embracing or denouncing counterinsurgency, but both for Britain and also for the United States to think more strategically, politically, and realistically about the nature of war to peace transition, and thereby to find ways or roles that may be more modest, but that nonetheless perpetuate our ability to shape strategic affairs internationally. Now, looking at the last few years, last 5 years, we can see already 3 or 4 strategic options for how to engage in the world without getting embroiled in these counterinsurgency type campaigns epitomized by Iraq and Afghanistan. I will just focus on 3, and then we can perhaps discuss alternatives in the Q&A section. The first option that seems very alluring is this, what I in the book called, or we in the book called, death from above. And of course, the Libya campaign is what we're talking about here. This is the notion of basically restricting our participation in conflicts to the use of air power, to use our technological advantage to best effect by providing strike capabilities, precise strike capabilities, to help a local proxy on the ground composed of local forces. The Libya campaign epitomized this particular approach, but of course it was only the update of what's called the Afghan model, the use of, again, precision-guided munitions in support of the Northern Alliance, with special forces providing a bridge between air and ground. Now, interestingly, after Libya, you had Air Force proponents crowing about the manifest advantages of intervening in this way. It was quick, it was cheap. Again, as in Kosovo, where a similar approach was used, NATO could intervene without sustaining one single casualty. And the results, although ambiguous and uncertain, at least in a first blush, look to be as good, if not better, than what Britain and the US have achieved in 10 years in Afghanistan. So what's not to like? Well, I think there's much to be said about the merits of this particular approach. But I also think we need to be very careful, because we don't get away from the fundamental requirement to think strategically, to think politically about war in a very Clausewitzian sense. So just because we limit our role in it doesn't necessarily make it any easier. And certainly there are key preconditions in Libya, but also in Afghanistan, and anywhere where this approach has been tried, that limit the applicability of this as a panacea to the problem of modern intervention. In Libya, for example, Gaddafi's own lack of subtlety and the urge to do something in the context of the Arab Spring and the democratic zeal and zeitgeist made it easier for NATO to find some sort of consensus and find the drive to act. The war was fought largely in the desert, which of course greatly facilitated the business of targeting. But even then, of course, this was also in Europe's backyard, so logistically and from a resource standpoint, this was far simpler than, for example, the situation in Afghanistan. We should think about those types of differences before we embrace this particular approach. This was the first time since the Second World War, it's notable that Britain could launch an airstrike from its actual own territory, which I think says a lot. Now, so the other thing to remember, of course, is that we cannot always define the way these conflicts will unfold. And even in Libya, we saw quite clearly how the enemy has evolved, to use a rather cliched way of putting it. The enemy adapted. The Gaddafi regime started decentralizing its forces, fielding the same vehicles as used by the rebels, spreading heavy weapons in the midst of populated areas, greatly complicating the targeting of NATO aircraft. This happened, of course, also in Afghanistan, where the Taliban used mountains and rugged terrain to conceal their activities, but also in the Balkans, all of which would greatly limit the applicability or the strategic decisiveness of air power as an isolated means. The other major condition or consideration with this approach is, of course, that if you do not have a presence on the ground, you have far less ownership over the consolidation of whatever security gains are made from the air. And in Libya, we can see this quite clearly, with the secondary and tertiary effects of the overthrow of the Gaddafi regime has had not just national issues, and there's a separatist struggle right now in Libya, of course, but also regional destabilizing forces have been unleashed, affecting everything from Mali, Chad, and so on. So there are always costs and trade-offs to these things, and I think there's an element of undue complacency by those Air Force proponents who see this now as the way to go, and let's forget about Afghanistan. A second approach that suffers from some of the similar preconditions is what we term the indirect approach. And you hear this a lot within military circles in this town, and also increasingly in the United Kingdom. The indirect approach, it speaks to the advising and training and assisting of local host nation forces in their fight against a homegrown insurgency. So that rather than going in as a third party and owning the struggle, you put the emphasis on the government that actually owns it. And of course, there are several advantages to this mode of engagement. It's lower cost, it puts local forces at the forefront with a culture, knowledge, awareness of the terrain and language, rather than, of course, having the occupying or occupier syndrome, where you have, US or UK soldiers patrolling the streets, an easy target not only for attack, but also for this rhetoric of occupation and subjugation. It's lower profile from a political standpoint. It's easier to sell to domestic constituents, not just for the host nation government, but also for that intervening. And it gets the balance right from the outset. For after all, these are local struggles to be owned by their local governments. You don't want to create what Donald Rumsfeld called, this dependency syndrome, looking at Kosovo, he saw a danger if you apply too much resources towards something, then it's very difficult to extricate yourself because you basically entrenched yourself within the political economy. He may have had a point, though of course the application of that particular philosophy in Afghanistan also leaves something to be desired. So the cases that we see here in terms of the indirect approach are El Salvador as one example. The US helped with 55 advisors on the ground officially defeat the FMLN using or operating through the local host nation forces. And for the British, the campaign in Dhofar, which interestingly has been unearthed or exhumed to provide a precedent for an indirect capability, much like the Malaya campaign was exhumed in 2003 to provide historical precedent for what the British were trying to do in Basra at the time. So there's great merit to this approach, obviously. I mean, who would want to be in the front seat when you could just operate vicariously instead? But again, we have to think about the enabling factors and the limitations to the approach. One key consideration is this notion of how do you apply leverage, how do you ensure that accountability or the proper operational behavior of the troops that you're assisting. Sitting in the back seat, in a sense, is good for various political reasons, but it can be very harmful strategically, and El Salvador points to this problem very clearly. Stories of human rights abuses, death squads, what have you. Now, if there's one lesson from the last 10 years, is that partnering has been an effective countermeasure against these problems. By partnering, I mean having the advisors work with day and night from the same place, their local equivalents, so as to ensure oversight, accountability, and a gradual learning process. But of course, partnering comes with a bunch of other implications. You need to have advisors then who are comfortable working from very rugged terrains, working with forces using a different language, a different culture, different environment, working practices. And it's uncertain whether we necessarily train our advisors or our forces for such purposes. There's been a lot of ad hocery and a lot of improvisation, which can be quite harmful. Pointing to the Special Operations Forces as a potential solution here, I think gets us some way towards an answer, but of course they're special for a reason. They're very few in number and a lot of resources have been invested in each one individually. You can't really mass produce them. And if you think about the requirements for effective partnering, you really want to have representation in each of the units that is being augmented. So the numerical implications can be quite severe. And even with the Village Stability Operations program in Afghanistan, we've seen how general purpose forces have had to be involved in one way or another because there simply aren't enough special forces or special operation forces around. Other requirements for this type of indirect approach. Well, first of all, I think one of the reasons that this is embraced is not because the indirect approach is the most strategically salient solution, but rather because it's politically comforting from a small p or domestic perspective. So we need to be very clear whether we're doing this to actually achieve objectives on the ground or to sort of be seen to do something that gets us away with avoiding major headlines in the papers. Because there's one thing about the indirect approach that history tells us is that it's anything but easy. It requires political buy-in and a political willingness to sustain risk and casualties. Whether it's green on blue or whether it's working from the front lines of the conflict, this will get often quite bloody. So we should not delude ourselves to think that advisory missions render foreign intervention easy. It never is. And of course, the British in Basra, as described in the book, is a cautionary tale, where Whitehall was very reluctant to provide the forces on the ground the political liberty to partner with their Iraqi equivalents. Instead, most of the training happened, off-site within the police academy in Jordan or a heavily fortified British base. How do you ensure oversight, leverage, and accountability in such a way? The other obvious requirement here, which will greatly limit the application of the indirect approach, is the need for a partner with whom to partner. It's obvious, but I think it's often forgotten. If you look at the main case studies here, El Salvador, Dhofar, Colombia, Philippines, all of them had a functioning, if somewhat imperfect government. So you could work through that entity. But what happens in a post-conflict situation like Iraq in 2003, Afghanistan in 2001, does a similar approach really apply? But most fundamentally, nothing about the indirect approach gets us away from the really core requirement for clearer strategic thinking. It should be obvious from everything we know about insurgency that professionalizing and augmenting the quality and quantity of the security forces provides but one piece of the puzzle. It is ultimately a political problem. So we need to concern ourselves not just with the security forces, but also with the political masters that they serve and the political plan that's in operation. By analogy, it serves very little good sharpening the scalpel if the doctor who's operating is drunk. So this is the case, and it is often the case, because of course these governments are to some degree responsible for fomenting an insurgency, so they're usually operating with some degree of legitimacy deficit. How do you go about reforming? How do you go about shaping the political level so that the security operations gain strategic meaning? Well, that's exactly the same problem we've been dealing with in Iraq, and it's exactly the same problem we're dealing with in Afghanistan. And whether you intervene directly or indirectly, it's an inescapable requirement. So again, we need to think strategically. This is not an operational panacea to a political problem. The final alternative, which I'll touch upon here, is this notion of contingency operations, and the activities of the intervention brigade in eastern DRC is perhaps the most recent example thereof. Other examples, Operation Artemis, where the French intervened, also in DRC, interestingly, in 2005, and also the British engagement in Sierra Leone in 2000. What I mean here is that a Western power will use its military resources and its strategic reach to do the combat phase of an operation, and then to leave off to the UN or to local parties to sort of do the cleaning up. And this can be effective, and Sierra Leone provides a good example thereof. But the key thing about Sierra Leone is that the British worked hard to train up the UN mission, to train up the local government, and really the effects of the combat mission only made sense because of very thorough follow-up. So again, as we scramble for strategic options, there are some very alluring and tempting alternatives out there, but none of them get away from the fundamental problem of strategy, and none of them get away from the fundamental challenge of operating through local partners or international partners, and understanding how that is going to affect the way in which we achieve strategic influence. With that, I'll conclude my comments, and I look forward to hearing both from Tom Mahnken and also from the audience in due course. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be given the opportunity to comment on this book. As an editor, as a journal editor, I always look at things with a critical eye. But this really is an excellent book, and it's a timely book. It is a book that joins a debate that's been building in recent years over the legacy of British counterinsurgency and really reinterpretation of British counterinsurgency practices historically. And so I think it's a very timely addition to that debate, as well as to the contemporary debate over counterinsurgency and thinking towards the future. I thought the most useful thing I could do with the limited time we have is to try to put the book into a little bit broader context, and to do it particularly from an American perspective, because in reading the book, there were aspects of the British experience in Basra and Helmand that echoed the American experience in Iraq and Afghanistan more broadly. And then there were other aspects that I think were key differences. So there were some echoes and there were some harmonies. So let me talk about those briefly. Hopefully there's a way to set up a broader discussion. The first echo, the first similarity between the British experience and the American experience in Iraq and Afghanistan has to do with the slowness and difficulty that both militaries had in adapting to a very different type of war than either had planned for. And if and both and David and Robert in the book make a point of the fact that the British Army went into Iraq believing that sort of it had unlocked the key to successful counterinsurgency, and I think that was a view shared in the United States as well, that the British had a better experience, better approach to fighting these types of wars. And yet, if one of the two armies did a better job of adapting, it was, and I'd say somewhat surprisingly and somewhat ironically, it was the larger military, the larger bureaucracy, the U.S. that did a marginally better job. I think it was assisted in doing so because of its own legacy that it brought into the war. So whereas the British Army came in feeling assured in its counterinsurgency record and its counterinsurgency bona fides, the U.S. military, the Army in particular, came in feeling that it wasn't very good at counterinsurgency, and that so the lessons of Vietnam, reinforced by people like John Nagel, who for his career wrote the right book at the right time, even though I think it's increasingly questionable in terms of its historical interpretation. That was the narrative, right? And you mentioned this in the book, that Nagel's book talks about how great the British were and how terrible the U.S. was. Neither of which was really true to the extent that he pressed it. If anything, however, that the rejection of Vietnam, the legacy of Vietnam, caused the U.S. to, in a number of cases, throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think particularly, and I'll get to this in a little bit, but the whole idea of whole of government approaches to counterinsurgency. The United States unquestionably did a better job of tapping civilian agencies to assist in stabilization and counterinsurgency in Vietnam than it did in Iraq or Afghanistan. But I think that the baby was thrown out with that bathwater. A second echo to take up what David was just talking about was the difficulty that both armies had in adopting the advisory mission, which is a key element of counterinsurgency. I started a project about 8 years ago looking at the U.S., British, and actually Australian history of advisory support, expecting to actually find a big contrast. But as I looked into the cases of Iraq and Afghanistan, what I found was more and more similarities and fewer and fewer contrasts. But the difficulty of getting Army institutions, whether British or American, to adopt advising as a key mission, again, is an echo. A third echo, and that comes through very strongly in the book, is the bureaucratization of counterinsurgency. I guess is probably the best way to put it. The extent that, say, tour lengths, promotion incentives, organizational culture affected the conduct of counterinsurgency in both countries. And again, I think for the U.S., this is actually a major contrast with Vietnam. For the United States, pre-deployment training was basically subtracted from a unit's time on ground. So you take a 12-month deployment or a 15-month deployment or a 7-month deployment, and you would, any training that you got, language, culture, would be subtracted from that overall deployment, which meant, logically, that training was sort of kept to a minimum because you didn't want to detract from your time on ground. Vietnam, the training was pre-deployment. It wasn't subtracted from the deployment tour, and so you have to actually go back and look at the types of pre-deployment training that American troops got in Vietnam. In many cases, much better than for Iraq and Afghanistan. Personnel policy. Advisors, members of PRTs were not and have not really, I'd say, been recognized for their service the way similarly senior officers in combat units have been recognized. And I think that's a challenge. And then there is the whole of government approach. Again, it's brought out very nicely in the book. Echoes the U.S. experience echoes that very nicely as well. Todd Greentree has an excellent piece in a recent issue of Journal of Strategic Studies called "Bureaucracy Does Its Thing in Afghanistan" that reflects his personal experience in Afghanistan as a political advisor. And it's actually quite a clever piece because the first several paragraphs, he essentially plagiarizes Bob Comer's monograph, "Bureaucracy Does Its Thing," just changing the place names. Doesn't really play Dryden because he cites him. But you get the idea that all the things that Comer wrote about in terms of the U.S. experience in Vietnam were at play and have been at play in the U.S. experience in Afghanistan as well. Which leads me to a final echo, which is about organizational culture. The book, I think, makes the very important point that organizational culture, the organization of military units, really shaped the way those units handled counterinsurgency during their tours and in their sectors. That's an area of considerable contrast between different militaries, but also contrast between different units. And David and Robert point out that in the case of the British Army, the regimental system, if anything, magnified that impact and made learning lessons across different units and different tours more difficult than might otherwise have been the case. Although I think it was difficult for the United States as well. Key differences, harmonies, if you will. The one that is mentioned in the book, but I think upon further reflection, I think it deserves even more emphasis, is just the difference between the level of political will and popular support for Iraq and Afghanistan in Britain and in the United States. And I think that the lack of political support, the lack of popular support, really did and has affected the British deployments in both countries in some obvious and not so obvious ways, in ways that the United States military has not had to face. Second, is the difference between being a major partner in an alliance and a coalition and the leader of that coalition. And I think in that respect, the position of the United States and Great Britain was different. The United States, Britain certainly, and British officers, British political leaders certainly had a voice in the formulation and implementation of strategy. 2 weeks ago, I was in Austin for a conference, University of Texas and King's College London, looking at the Anglo-American relationship during the Bush-Blair era. And I think it's even more clear to me now than it was before that conference, just how important a voice Britain had. That having been said, the United States took the lead for establishing a strategy, an overall strategy in Iraq and an overall strategy in Afghanistan. And that meant when there was time for a large-scale change, a large-scale adaptation, the United States could drive that. Britain had less freedom to do so. A final contrast just has to do with regional differences. And this gets to the case studies that the book is anchored on. It's worth pointing out, and I think future historians will have to spend a lot of time looking at this as well. Basra, Basra is not al-Anbar. Now that wound up being good for the UK early on in the occupation of Iraq. But I think it wound up being posing more of a challenge as things went on. So if you look at some of the big causes of the turnaround in the larger insurgency in Iraq, they didn't apply to Basra. Whether it was the infiltration of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, whether it was the Anbar awakening, whether it was the surge, whether it was targeted special operations against enemy leadership. The contrast between Basra and other parts of Iraq, particularly Al-Anbar, is stronger than the comparison. And I can make other similar points about Helmand versus other regions of Afghanistan. That shouldn't detract from the overall value of the book, but I think we should put that into perspective. Two last questions and comments raised by the book. One, the book concludes with questions about institutionalization, the extent to which the legacy of Iraq and Afghanistan will remain institutionalized in the British Army. I think that is very much a question here in the United States as well, and I think we do run the risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, certainly in our case. And then finally, the future. I tend to think and this actually goes back to Robert's point about counterinsurgency being conservative. I half take the point, but you know what both Iraq and Afghanistan and Iraq were about was overthrowing hostile, repugnant regimes and replacing them with something different. Certainly, at least in the case of Iraq, a real demographic transformation of who was actually in power. The majority actually was in power after the overthrow of the Baathists. But those cases are, I would say, atypical of counterinsurgency. So that's the half where I agree. That much more the historical norm is the case where a friendly outside power, such as the United States, assists a beleaguered government in shoring up its sovereignty, building up its institutions, and defeating insurgency. I'd say less frequent are the types of interventions, even smaller scale interventions, and still less common are these wars for unlimited objectives, overthrowing an adversary and then rebuilding it. So, to the extent that our experience can inform the future tasks of assisting beleaguered friendly governments and helping build their capacity, then I think this work, this scholarship will be tremendously important. So thank you very much.
Excuse me, thank you. I'd like to open it up for questions now. What we'll do is Catherine, is there a microphone floating around? Oh, great. So if you can just be sure to set your name and affiliation. We have about 20 minutes for discussion. Do we have any questions? Right there, Stanley.
Stanley Kober. So far we've been discussing us more than the enemy. It seems to me you have to know the enemy. And the primary enemy here is Al-Qaeda. With all due respect to Honduras and Sierra Leone, Al-Qaeda has come back from the dead. 10 years ago, who would have imagined that they would be involved in operations from the Maghreb to Southeast Asia? It was extraordinary. So I have several questions about Al-Qaeda, because if we are going to do this, we need to answer. First, how do they recruit? They're taking a lot of casualties. They are replacing the casualties. You have Europeans going to Syria to fight for Al-Qaeda. What is the attraction? Second, how do they train? Who's training them? Go back to the American Revolutionary War. 1776, what did Washington have? 1781, Baron von Steuben and other people came over here. We were able to conduct an operation against the British Army at Yorktown, very professional. A lot changed in those 5 years. Who are the equivalent for Al-Qaeda and the Taliban? Because they weren't this good 10 years ago. Third, the logistics. I really don't understand the logistics. They do not have state support. How can they go up against NATO, toe-to-toe, and be supplied? Who is in charge of the logistics? How do they do this? And fourth, how do they communicate? I mentioned all the Europeans. How, everybody speaks different languages. How can they engage in operations when everybody speaks different languages? So those are my questions. If we are going to deal with this adversary, do we have any good answers? I'll admit, I don't have any good answers to these questions.
Does anybody want to try to take the set of very difficult questions on?
I can quickly address it. Of course, this is a question you should ask my boss Bruce Hoffman or Dan Wyman or some terrorist expert, of course. From our perspective, the counter question would be sort of what would interpreting Al-Qaeda as an insurgency, as a global insurgency, do for our understanding of that movement, of the logistics, of operations, and the nature of the organization? Will that help us understand the nature of that problem, or will it actually confuse our understanding? And seeing ourselves as sort of a global counterinsurgency movement against global insurgency terrorism, will that help the way we deal with that problem? So rather than answer your really, really difficult questions that are really beyond me, those are the questions I would be interested in. And that's where I think, in that particular case, for me, counterinsurgency might not do the trick. or interpreting that as a global insurgency. I don't think that will particularly help us in our understanding. We should rather focus on, as Tom mentioned, the support of foreign governments that are beleaguered internally, etc., and sort of leave that concept to those more specific campaigns.
Just to build on that, just a very short addendum, one of the key strategic methods of Al-Qaeda, as I'm sure you already know, is to exploit long-running grievances and long-running local disputes, and to basically allow them to metastasize into something much more complicated. And we see this, saw this in Iraq, we see it in Yemen, we see it in the Maghreb, and of course also in Afghanistan. They find a local partner that benefits from their support structure, which, albeit not state-sanctioned, certainly is at the receiving end of a lot of, informal money flows that associated with organized crime, but also with charities. So one of the key challenges going forward is to focus exactly on the questions that you ask, not just to understand Al-Qaeda, but to understand the conflicts that they exploit to their own ends, and to find ways of decoupling Al-Qaeda's presence from those with much more limited and perhaps even reconcilable agendas.
Great. I have a question to help perhaps get some conceptual clarity. And actually it takes up Robert's point that counterinsurgency is inherently conservative, and actually it's for Tom also. When you said that Iraq and Afghanistan are not the norm because they're radical in some ways, we went in to overthrow two governments. Would that not be, the overthrowing aspect, not be a very different thing than the counterinsurgency aspect, which only came on later? And so is the counterinsurgency hence conservative of the new regime, where the radical aspect was the overthrowing and sort of becoming the power center?
What I would say was atypical. Each of the cases was historically atypical, right? So, in the case of Iraq, overthrow the Ba'athist regime, and Army disbanded itself, basically had to create brand new institutions. Accompanying the overthrow of the Ba'athist regime was, the fall from power of the minority, the Sunni minority, and the rise to power of the Shia majority. Added to that was then the intervention of Al-Qaeda. So you had, the need to build new institutions. You need new institutions with a different, ethnic, religious composition, and you also had to deal with outside terrorists intervening. In the case of Afghanistan, in late 2001, early 2002, we overthrew the Taliban. A repugnant regime that was recognized by only 3 foreign governments. And then again, we were faced with the situation where we had to build up not only military institutions but governmental institutions from the ground up. Though I'd say that historically those are atypical situations. So we go to the other kind of canonical cases, whether it's El Salvador in the 1980s, we were assisting the government of El Salvador and the armed forces. The Philippines, assisting the government of the Philippines and the armed forces of the Philippines. Most of the other cases that you can look at, or conversely, the other cases of sort of post-war reconstruction, the big cases of post-war reconstruction, whether it's Germany or Japan after World War II, just to take examples, you had the institutions more or less in place, even though you had a new government in place. So I think it's doing all of those things at once is atypical. Not that we should ignore the requirements to do that in the future, but we should also realize that that's unlikely to be the norm in the future.
Quick follow-up. Toppling a regime and then quickly turning around and calling it a counterinsurgency as if this is a completely new problem we're facing. I think that would be disingenuous in many different ways, and particularly it's unhelpful because that doesn't help us understand the problem. If we've toppled the regime and then there's resistance building up afterwards, it's not because of an ingrained sort of political grievance or a revolt against the established order. It's because there's remnants of the old regime that are still against toppling it, or there might be other grievances or influenced by Al-Qaeda that wasn't there in the first place, or things like that. So I don't think that helps us in dealing with the problem. Perhaps then occupation strategies would be sort of a more relevant historical analogy to use rather than counterinsurgency when you've toppled the regime and established a new order. And then for the typicality of toppling a regime, I don't think the problem of rogue regimes are going anywhere. So we will probably continue to engage in that type of behavior. But if that should be followed by a counterinsurgency campaign or not, that's a different question.
Do we have any other questions here in the audience? A quiet bunch this morning. Okay, here we go, right here. In the front, and then go to...
C.M. Brown from the American Security Project here in Washington. David Ucko mentioned three alternatives, evidently, to counterinsurgency operations that haven't worked. He didn't indicate a fourth, which could be don't do it, or don't do it unless you've got a partner, unless you can have confidence in an indirect approach, possibly supplemented by death from above, and possibly supplemented by some expeditionary or contingency operations which are quick in, quick out. But that seemed to be at least the thrust of what you're saying. I haven't read the book yet. Is that correct? That basically you've moved toward a position which is in contrast to the enthusiasm for counterinsurgency which prevailed in Washington about 5 or 6 years ago with the issuance of the Petraeus-Nagel new counterinsurgency doctrine?
That's an excellent question. Thank you very much. I find myself, this is obviously a very dichotomized struggle here between the people who are very pro-counterinsurgency and those who are very against counterinsurgency. And the way I look at it is, in Afghanistan and Iraq, counterinsurgency was approached as the least bad option to extricate ourselves or to sort of find some excuse for basically leaving on relatively good terms. But by no means would I suggest that this is a model for the future to basically go in with very little understanding of the local politics, very little understanding of our role in affecting those politics, and then to basically improvise our approach towards something resembling, say, the Iraqi surge. So I think you're onto something. I think you're absolutely right. In future interventions, much greater care and attention needs to be paid to the local opportunities that can be exploited to counter local challenges. Unfortunately, it has been a tendency of the West, not just the US, to disregard precisely the type of information that could be useful in making that analysis. Whether it's a Somalia intervention in the 1990s, Iraq in 2003, or Afghanistan, those experts with knowledge of the clan structure, the tribal politics, the socioeconomic structures have been deliberately excluded. I mean, either they were unable to make their expertise usable, or I think in more cases than not, they just simply weren't listened to, because internalizing all that complexity prior to going would provide such a forceful argument against going in the first place that we just don't want to muddy the waters. There's a strong argument in the book that says, none of this really matters if we're quite content to sit at home and not engage in the rest of the world. This is all contingent on expeditionary ambitions. For Britain, they have a choice, though they also have a self-identification as a global power. For the US as a global hegemon, there may be less of one. You're sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't. But one thing that will remain constant is the need to treat these conflicts on their own terms and to get much better at actually understanding the countries that we so fervently seek to transform. Sadly, we just don't have that structurally inbuilt. So how it's going to be done, I'm not an optimist, but one thing the book tries to do is at least point out the importance of precisely that type of analysis.
Ultimately, militaries don't decide whether to intervene or not. What they can decide or what they can affect is whether they are prepared should their political leaderships decide to do that. And in my view, I think it's better to have a well-prepared military than a poorly prepared one, because certainly what we had after Vietnam was in the U.S. military was a conscious effort. It was abetted by signals from political leadership, but we don't need to worry about counterinsurgency anymore, that we will consign these types of missions to military operations other than war, read military operations other than the ones we care about. And so as a result, when we did intervene, the U.S. military was unprepared. And so do you want a military that's prepared or not, realizing that the military doesn't make the decision to intervene? But it may have to respond to a decision to do so.
Another question?
I'm David. Is that it? I'm David Wise. I'm a businessman. My question actually follows up on what Thomas just said. Since at least Vietnam, we've had schizophrenia in the United States, where counterinsurgency is either embraced and then an alternative period where it's ostracized and then it's embraced again, and we never can seem to get it clear as to what our approach is. And in those periods of ostracism, the experts and the war colleagues and other people who should possibly be thinking up these approaches don't get funded or don't get heard. We've also had the Army and the Marines having different views on this. Well, my question comes back to a phrase I think you used twice, Thomas, in your comments, where you said you hope we wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think I know what you mean, but I would like to just ask you if you could elaborate on what you think the risk is there.
Sure. The U.S. military, British military has adapted more or less, has learned a lot of lessons over the last 12 years. And I think the big question now moving forward is that the extent to which they are going to be institutionalized, that a number of the capabilities that have been developed after a lot of painful experience over the last 12 years are going to be retained or not. I think there are a lot of bureaucratic and organizational incentives against doing so. Right? So the current defense strategic guidance says, thou shalt not conduct long-duration stability operations, which essentially tells the services, all right, these are missions that you don't particularly like anyway, so here's an excuse not to plan for them. There is the question of what happens to our advisory capabilities in the future. Now, whether it's counterinsurgency or advisory capabilities, at least in the U.S. Army, there is an organizational home, and that's in special forces. And actually, I think one of the ironies of Iraq and Afghanistan was that Army Special Forces, at least initially, during the initial period, were not used for the tasks that they were best trained to do. They were actually used for other things. Eventually, it got back to it. So I think one question is the extent to which those missions will remain resident in Special Operations Forces. The other question is that the extent to which they will be resident more generally in the force. Abetting the tendency after Vietnam to forget about counterinsurgency was the very real threat posed by the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact in Central Europe. So there was not only the painful memory that we wanted to leave behind, but there was a very real threat that was ahead of us. We're not in that situation today. And so I think first it's for all the very good reasons mentioned earlier, we would be unwise to forget even some painful memories. On the other hand, there's I think only a limited number of other threats out there that armies, large ground armies, are going to have to deal with. So again, I think that makes the case even stronger for retaining some of those core capabilities for counterinsurgency. However politically unpopular it is today, it's an investment in the future.
Time for one final question right up here.
We have two.
We have two if you can make them quick. Let's just take them together. So we'll go here first.
Thank you very much. My name is Reyes Cole. I work for the Marine Corps. We just finished working with the Army for the last 3 years on rewriting the Counterinsurgency Manual, on rewriting the Joint Pub on counterinsurgency. So my question to y'all is, in your research for the book, what did you find some of the institutionalization challenges are going to be in the Army and Marine Corps and the British experience as well? What are some of the challenges, but more importantly, what are some of the opportunities that we have to institutionalize some of the best practices for COIN? Thank you.
We'll take the final question right there.
Yes, my name is David Travis. I'm with the U.S. Department of State, just coming off a assignment up with the U.S. Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute at Carlisle. Just to comment, following up on Tom, basically the Army has gone and elevated stability operations on a par with offense and defense. Now that's been established doctrinally. We'll have to go and see how that is actually institutionalized, but at least in doctrine they have recognized that stability operations, which is a large component of counterinsurgency, is going to be accorded greater attention, both in terms of special forces and also the general forces.
One of 4 key tasks.
Why don't we take these in reverse order? Tom first? No? Okay.
Well, thanks for coming all the way to the right here. On the institutionalization piece, we devoted an entire chapter, and I think it's an unprecedented analysis, really, of the efforts within British Armed Forces to learn and institutionalize the lessons that they've encountered in Iraq and Afghanistan. And unfortunately, having written a book also on the US military and its efforts at institutionalization, the picture for Britain doesn't look very good, in part because the climate within the institution, but also politically, is very close and very narrow. I can't really get into the reasons for that, but they don't have the same outspoken climate of debate online or in communities. And if you talk to British active duty servicemen, it's very difficult to get them to speak on the record. It's just very sensitive. So that's one key challenge. And I applaud the US to the degree that it's been much more open and forthright and self-critical in examining where it went wrong and what it did right. I think the major obstacle, I think, for both countries is how do you prevent the armed services from going back to a conception of war as apolitical, as militarily decisive, and as wholly separated from peace? I think that's exactly what we talk about the sine wave. That's a tendency, and it makes sense, of course, because the military sees that as its remit. But unfortunately, as we know, once they're deployed, usually with very little civilian support, they are asked to conduct increasingly political tasks in a highly political atmosphere. So how we can get away from this bifurcation of the military doing military things and then the State Department or the whole of government or the comprehensive approach, none of which really have many assets to actually send on the ground, do theirs. I think probably one of the most effective ways forward is to drop the parallel dichotomy between counterinsurgency and conventional. Because so long as we keep up this notion that there's a choice out there between war as it has presented itself in the last few decades and war as we'd like it to unfold, of course, institutionally we'll always go for the easier option. The problem for me is whether we call it counterinsurgency, whether we call it stability operations, whatever we call it, there are very, very few instances where our desire to limit it to the conventional phase has actually been effective or possible. So perhaps we need to marry up everything that we've learned for the last 10, 15 years, not just to the rubric of counterinsurgency, but to what we know about war to peace transition and military intervention. And that may be a way of making everything that we've learned more relevant than to a sort of a core, increasingly niche community of analysts. So as you rewrite FM 3-24, I would really use very much more generic military terms and analysis, perhaps center of gravity, critical vulnerabilities, strategic planning, a strategic estimate of the situation that really is far more generic and therefore accessible to a broader audience. That's my contribution to that. I don't know whether...
Yeah, I thought I would tie that one to some previous questions about the future of COIN and don't do it, for example. First of all, I think one of the real lessons coming out of this decade is that our ability to transform other societies to our wishes are very limited. And this just doesn't just apply to counterinsurgency operations. It applies to development aid, it applies to nation building, whatever you call it. But our ability to plan and transform other societies to our wishes, that is much more limited than we thought at the beginning of this century. COIN has almost come to replace sound strategic thinking. And I think that will continue to be a challenge in terms of institutionalizing the lessons of the last decade, because we now tend to blame COIN for the failure in Afghanistan. And Ambassador Eichen very recently published a text in Foreign Affairs where he started out by saying that the aim was clear enough in Afghanistan, but the strategy to achieve those aims proved vexing. And I think he's got it all wrong. It was a lacking aim that was the real problem in Afghanistan. The fact that it changed all the time, the fact that coalitions, partners had completely different aims, that there were 3 parallel operations going on at the same time. And how do you produce a sound strategy or an approach like COIN within that sort of strategic mind, when there's no aim, when there's no clear strategy, when there's no end state that we can agree on? How do you produce a strategy as a military strategist or as a civilian planner? So that's going to be a continued problem, the mix-up between COIN and sound strategic thinking. And then we have what David also talked about, the sort of the pigeonholing of COIN. So we tend to come up with new concepts for each and every sort of type of operation we see, and especially this last decade we've had hundreds of different concepts trying to get at what contemporary warfare is about. COIN is one of them. And if 3-24 is only going to address what we come to refer to as counterinsurgency operations, then that will be much too limited. We have to, as David said, see that this is part of a much broader problem, that the tactical lessons of the last decade, whether we call them COIN or state building or stability operations, will be very applicable whenever we deploy forces in foreign countries in the future as well. And that shouldn't just be a 3-24 problem, it should be part of all of doctrine writing in the US and other armies. The third really problematic aspect in terms of institutionalization is the civilian aspects of operations. As all the traditional COIN thinkers would say, these are primarily political operations, or there's an 80-20 or a 75-25 ratio, civilian political versus military aspects of operation. We're still only talking about the military aspects of counterinsurgency operations. We're not seeing doctrine writing, we're not seeing institutional reform, we're not seeing a vast increase in civilian capacity to conduct these types of operations within the context of state building or counterinsurgency or stability operations. And as long as we're not doing that, I'm afraid whatever institutional reform or memorizing or adaptation will take place within the military will never be enough.
Thank you so much. I want to thank David and Robert for being here, and thank you for writing this book, which I think is an important contribution to making sense of the last decade plus and making sure that these lessons aren't lost for the future. Thank Tom for commenting on the book, for being here. And thank you all for coming out today, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks so much.